He thought he had it all: the corner office, the sycophantic applause, and the 22-year-old model draped on his arm. Tonight, at the year's most exclusive charity ball, he was a king. His ex-wife, a forgotten footnote, a woman he'd discarded like last season's fashion. He imagined her somewhere small, somewhere quiet, probably weeping over faded photographs. But he was about to learn a brutal lesson in underestimation. Because just as he was basking in the glow of his perfect new life, the roar of a private jet engine would shatter the night, and a woman would emerge who wasn't just surviving, she was thriving on a level he couldn't even comprehend. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a galaxy of artificial stars. Crystals dripped from chandeliers, catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the faces of New York's elite. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, hummed with the murmur of discreet fortunes and brokered power. At the center of his own small, glittering constellation stood Lucian Drake. Lucian, at 42, was a man sculpted by ambition and polished by success. His tuxedo was Tom Ford, tailored so precisely it seemed a second skin. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe Nautilus, its face a cool blue ocean of quiet confidence, winked with every gesture. And his greatest accessory of the evening was currently adjusting the silk of her canary yellow gown beside him. Tiffany Dubois. Tiffany was everything Lucian's ex-wife, Amelia, had not been in those final dreary years. She was young, her beauty as loud and arresting as a pop song. Her laughter was high and frequent, her eyes wide with an admiration that fed Lucian's ego more than any seven-figure deal. She was, in his estimation, the perfect emblem of his victory over middle-aged mediocrity, over a past he was determined to bury. "Lucian, darling," Tiffany cooed, her fingers tracing the lapel of his jacket. "Is that Mr. Chen from the Shanghai Consortium? You should go say hello." Lucian glanced over, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, before he smoothed it into a paternal smile. "All in good time, my dear. Networking is a hunt. You never let the prey see you coming." He took a slow sip of his champagne, his gaze sweeping the room with an air of proprietary ownership. He had clawed his way into this world. He'd started with nothing but a sharp mind and a capacity for ruthlessness that others mistook for drive. He'd built Drake Capital from a shoebox office in the financial district into a boutique powerhouse. And he'd done it, he often reminded himself, despite the dead weight of his marriage. He and Amelia had been college sweethearts. She was the quiet, intelligent art history major who had seen potential in the brash business student. For 15 years, she had been his anchor, his confidant, the one who managed their home, raised their son, who was now safely away at a Swiss boarding school, and soothed his ego after every corporate battle. She had created the serene, orderly home that allowed him to be a shark in the boardroom. But success had changed him, or perhaps revealed him. The more he earned, the more he craved. He started to see Amelia not as his partner, but as part of his old life, the life before the private jets and the Hamptons estate. Her quiet support began to feel like a lack of ambition. Her contentment felt like complacency. Her gentle reminders to spend time with their son felt like nagging. He started to resent her for knowing him when he was just Lucian, the kid from Queens with a chip on his shoulder, not Lucian Drake, the titan of industry. The affair with Tiffany, an intern at his firm, had been a cliché, but a thrilling one. It was a confirmation of his status. When he'd told Amelia, he had expected tears hysterics. Instead, She had looked at him with a profound, unnerving stillness. There was no screaming match, no thrown porcelain. She had simply looked at him, her grey eyes like storm clouds gathering over a calm sea, and said, "I see." The divorce had been swift and on his part brutal. He'd been generous, he told himself. He gave her the suburban house they'd shared, a house that now felt like a mausoleum of their shared past, and a settlement that he considered more than fair for a woman with no discernible career prospects. He had, in effect, paid her to disappear. And she had. For 2 years, there had been almost no word. Their communication was filtered through lawyers and assistants, mostly concerning their son's school schedule. He heard through the grapevine that she'd sold the house. He assumed she had moved somewhere sensible, perhaps back to Ohio, to be near her parents, to live out her days in quiet obscurity. The thought brought him a smug sense of satisfaction. He had moved on, ascended. She had faded away. "Isn't that Beatrice de Rothschild over there?" Tiffany whispered, tugging on his arm again, her voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "Her family owns like all the best vineyards in Bordeaux." "Yes," Tiffany Lucien said, a touch condescendingly. "I'm aware of who she is." He made a mental note to coach her more thoroughly on the art of social subtlety. She was beautiful, but she was not of this world. She was a tourist. He was a resident. He guided her through the crowd, accepting compliments on his latest acquisition, a majority stake in a burgeoning tech firm, and on Tiffany, who blushed and smiled prettily on cue. He felt the familiar thrill of power and envy, the twin currents that ran this city. He was the man other men wanted to be, with the woman other men wanted to have. It was perfect. A perfect night in his perfect life. He was chatting with a rival hedge fund manager, a portly man named George, when he noticed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It was a small thing, a change in the ambient hum. A few conversations near the grand entrance had faltered. Heads were turning not towards anyone inside the ballroom, but towards the vast floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the terrace. Beyond the terrace, the emerald expanse of Central Park was a dark, sleeping giant. But it was the sky above it that had captured everyone's attention. Descending, with an impossible predatory grace, was a helicopter, its navigation lights blinking like malevolent stars. It was a sleek, impossibly modern machine, an Augusta Westland AW-109, its lines sharp and aggressive. It wasn't the lumbering functional craft used by news stations or police. This was a statement. "Who the hell is arriving by chopper?" George grunted, squinting. The Mayor Lucian felt a prickle of annoyance. Whoever it was, they were stealing his thunder. An arrival like that was a calculated power play, and it wasn't his. As the helicopter settled onto the hotel's private helipad, a feature so exclusive, Lucian himself had only used it twice, a wave of murmurs rippled through the ballroom. Then, a secondary sound began to build, a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of jet engines, powerful ones, spooling down. It wasn't coming from JFK or LaGuardia. It was close. Too close. Lucian, along with everyone else, turned his attention to the sky beyond the park. Out of the darkness, a behemoth emerged. It was a Gulfstream G700, its white fuselage gleaming under the moonlight. A silver shark slicing through the night. It wasn't landing at an airport. It was flying, impossibly unnervingly low, a thunderous passage directly over Central Park. It was a flyby, a salute, a declaration of presence so audacious, so extravagantly potent, that it silenced the entire ballroom. The G700 dipped its wings in a gesture of almost regal arrogance before climbing sharply, its engines roaring a final defiant farewell as it banked towards Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. The room erupted in a cacophony of questions. My God, who has a G700 do a flyby for a party that had to be Sinclair? Only Dominic Sinclair is that much of a showman. What's he doing here? The name hung in the air electric. Dominic Sinclair. The reclusive, almost mythical billionaire. A man who had built a tech empire from his college dorm room and then pivoted into aerospace sustainable energy and private space exploration. He was younger than Lucy and wealthier by a factor of 100 and operated on a global stage that made Lucian's world of New York finance look like a provincial playground. Sinclair didn't attend charity balls. He bought the charities. The doors from the terrace swung open. A collective gasp, a unified intake of breath swept the room. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the city lights, stood two figures who had emerged from the helicopter. The first was, as expected, Dominic Sinclair. He was tall and lean, dressed in a simple, perfectly cut black suit with no tie, an open-collared white shirt underneath. His presence was an immediate vortex of power, his ruggedly handsome face set in an expression of detached amusement. But it wasn't Sinclair who held the room in a state of suspended animation. It was the woman by his side. She was a vision in a gown of deep sapphire velvet that seemed to drink the light, hugging a figure that was at once elegant and powerful. A cascade of diamonds, the legendary star of an evening necklace from Harry Winston, glittered at her throat, a piece so famous it was usually confined to a museum vault. Her hair, once a simple brown, was now a rich chestnut, swept up in a chignon that highlighted the graceful line of her neck. Her face was the same, yet entirely different. The quiet uncertainty was gone, replaced by a serene, unshakable confidence. Her lips, painted a defiant red, were curved in a soft, knowing smile. Lucian's champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was lost in the roaring silence of his own mind. Because the woman standing next to Dominic Sinclair, the woman wearing a king's ransom in diamonds, the woman who had just arrived by helicopter after a private jet salute, was his ex-wife, Amelia. For a moment, the world tilted on its axis, and Lucian Drake, the man who was never caught off guard, was utterly lost. His brain refused to process the image before him. It was like seeing a character from a black-and-white film suddenly step into the vibrant, high-definition reality of his life, rendered in colors he never knew she possessed. That was Amelia. But it was not his Amelia. His Amelia was sensible shoes and comfortable cardigans. His Amelia read books on rainy afternoons and planned parent-teacher conferences with meticulous care. His Amelia smelled of lavender and paper, not of what was unmistakably a custom-blended scent from a Parisian perfumer, a fragrance that drifted across the room and spoke of money so old it was silent. This Amelia, this creature of impossible poise and luminescence, was a stranger. Her posture was different, ramrod straight, her shoulders back, occupying her space with an authority he had never seen in her. Her gaze, as it swept the room, was not the shy, deferential glance he remembered. It was a cool, appraising look, the look of a woman who was not merely attending an event, but presiding over it. Tiffany, oblivious, squeezed his arm. "Wow," she breathed, her voice filled with childlike awe. "Who is that? She's incredible. And that necklace, is that—" "It's Amelia," Lucian heard himself say. The name felt alien in his mouth, a word from a forgotten language. Tiffany's head snapped towards him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Amelia, you're Amelia?" The question was laced with a disbelief that mirrored his own, but for entirely different reasons. In Tiffany's world, ex-wives were supposed to be cautionary tales, faded photographs in an old wallet. They were not supposed to materialize at the most important social event of the year, dripping in diamonds and on the arm of a man like Dominic Sinclair. The room, which had been frozen, began to thaw into a frenzied sea of whispers. The sound was like the rustling of 1,000 silk gowns, a sibilant tide of speculation and shock that washed over Lucien. He could feel the eyes on him, the eyes of his rivals, his allies, the society doyenne, whose approval he had so carefully cultivated. He was no longer the center of attention. He was now an object of intense, pitying curiosity. The king had become the court jester in the span of 30 seconds. Dominic Sinclair, with a hand lightly at Amelia's back, guided her into the room. They moved with an unhurried grace, a magnetic bubble of calm in the churning social waters. The host of the evening, a flustered real estate magnate, rushed forward to greet them, his face a mask of delighted shock. "Mr. Sinclair, what an unexpected honor. And Mrs. Drake, I mean, Ms. It's Sterling." Amelia's voice cut through the air, clear and calm. It was the same voice, yet it held a new resonance, a timbre of command. Amelia Sterling. Sterling. She had taken back her maiden name. A small act of rebellion he hadn't even bothered to notice during the paperwork, but which now felt like a declaration of war. She smiled at the host, a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when she glanced momentarily, almost dismissively, in Lucien's direction. That single fleeting look pierced him more effectively than any shouted accusation ever could have. It was a look of utter indifference. It said, "You are no longer relevant to my world." George, the hedge fund manager, clapped a heavy hand on Lucien's shoulder, his expression one of morbid fascination. "Drake, didn't know your ex-wife ran in those circles. Sinclair's circle is tighter than a gnat's." "Well, you know." "How the devil did that happen?" Lucien couldn't form a reply. His mouth was dry. He watched as a path cleared for Amelia and Sinclair, as if they were royalty, parting a sea of commoners. People who had been clamoring for Lucien's attention just minutes before were now desperately trying to catch Sinclair's eye, or even more unbelievably, Amelia's. Beatrice de Rothschild, the very woman Tiffany had pointed out with such reverence, approached Amelia with 2 kisses to the air and a familiar warmth. "Amelia, darling," the French heiress said, her English accented. "You look absolutely breathtaking. That color on you is divine. I trust the flight from Geneva was pleasant?" "As pleasant as a 10-hour flight can be," Beatrice, Amelia replied with an easy laugh. "Dominic insisted we take the G700. He's such a fusspot about legroom." The casual offhand way she said it, the G700, as if discussing a ride in an Uber, sent a fresh wave of shock through Lucien. He had flown on a private jet exactly 7 times in his life, and each time he had felt like an emperor. Amelia was speaking of it as a minor convenience. Geneva. What in God's name was she doing in Geneva? He had pictured her in a small town in Ohio, maybe volunteering at the local library. The chasm between his imagination and this reality was so vast, it gave him vertigo. "Darling, I'm getting another drink," Tiffany said, her voice strained. The admiration was gone, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. Her canary yellow dress suddenly looked cheap and garish next to Amelia's sapphire velvet. Her youth which had seemed like such a vibrant asset, now just looked callow. She was out of her depth, a guppy in a tank of sharks, and she knew it. She scurried away towards the bar, not looking back. Left alone, Lucian felt naked, exposed. He could hear snippets of conversations around him. Sold the house for 8 figures in an all-cash offer to a shell corporation. Heard she's the one who brokered the Sinclair Aero new engine deal. They say she's the brains behind his latest European expansion. Didn't even use a lawyer for the final settlement. They say she represented herself. He had no idea who he was dealing with. It was all nonsense. It had to be Amelia, the woman who could never balance their checkbook, a corporate negotiator, the brains behind Dominic Sinclair. The rumors were absurd, the fevered imaginings of a gossip-starved crowd. He had been the brains of their marriage. He had been the one who understood the world. She was the one who arranged flowers. He watched as Sinclair, with a nod to Amelia, was drawn into a conversation with a senator and a tech CEO. And Amelia, left on her own, for a moment, did not shrink. She did not look for a familiar face or retreat to the sidelines. She stood with perfect equanimity, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her posture radiating a formidable self-possession. Then she turned. Her eyes, those grey eyes that had once looked at him with such adoration, scanned the crowd and landed squarely on him. There was no surprise, no anger, no pain. There was only a calm, deliberate recognition. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod that was both a greeting and a dismissal, she turned away, moving towards a group that included the curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Lucian felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a dread that had nothing to do with social embarrassment and everything to do with a fundamental reordering of his universe. He had written a story about his divorce, a story in which he was the protagonist, the victor. He had cast Amelia as a minor character, a tragic but necessary casualty on his path to greatness. But as he watched her move through the glittering ballroom, a woman reborn, a woman of substance and mystery, he was struck by a terrifying thought. What if he had gotten the story wrong? What if all this time he wasn't the protagonist at all? What if he was just the villain in someone else's triumphant beginning? The thought was so disorienting, so completely alien to his carefully constructed self-image that he felt a sudden, desperate need to flee. But he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, a statue in a Tom Ford suit, watching his past stride confidently into a future he couldn't have imagined, a future it seemed he would have no part in. The name Amelia Sterling echoed in Lucian's mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the fortress of his ego. Sterling. It sounded like something solid, something of immense value. It sounded expensive. And as he watched her, he began to understand that the transformation was not just skin deep. It wasn't just the gown, the diamonds, or the billionaire escort. It was in the way she held herself, the economy of her movements, the quiet intensity in her eyes. It was a complete cellular-level reinvention. He needed to understand. The not knowing was a physical torment, an itch under his skin. He began to move his feet, finally obeying his commands, with a vague plan to get closer, to listen, to glean some scrap of information that would make sense of this madness. He found Tiffany by the bar, nervously shredding a cocktail napkin. "That's really her?" Tiffany asked, her voice a hushed whisper. "She looks so different." "People change," Lucian said, the words sounding hollow and stupid, even to himself. He grabbed a glass of whiskey from the bar and downed it in one fiery gulp, the burn a welcome distraction. She doesn't just look different, Lucian. Tiffany pressed her eyes wide and fearful. She looks important. People are deferring to her. Beatrice de Rothschild kissed her. Beatrice de Rothschild looks at me like I'm something she scraped off her Louboutins. The raw honesty of her statement hung in the air. Tiffany, for all her naivete, was a keen observer of the social food chain. She knew exactly what was happening. Her status, derived entirely from her association with him, was plummeting in real time. And Amelia's was skyrocketing. Lucian's gaze was fixed on his ex-wife. She was now in a tight circle with the museum curator and a celebrated architect. She wasn't just listening. She was talking, gesturing with a hand that was not weighed down by a gaudy engagement ring like Tiffany's, but was instead adorned with a single, elegant platinum band on her right hand. She spoke about the structural integrity of the museum's new wing, referencing a specific cantilever design and the challenges of sourcing travertine from a particular quarry in Italy. The architect, a notoriously prickly old man named Alistair Finch, was listening with rapt attention, nodding slowly. Precisely, Ms. Sterling. The thermal expansion coefficient of that particular stone is a nightmare. Most people only see the aesthetics. Aesthetics are the result of engineering, Alistair, not a substitute for it, Amelia said, with a small smile. Form follows function after all. Lucian felt a fresh wave of disorientation. Amelia, who used to ask him to explain the difference between a stock and a bond, was discussing architectural engineering with Alistair Finch. He remembered a time years ago when they were renovating their kitchen. She had been obsessed with the layout, the flow, the materials. He had dismissed it as domestic fussing. He had picked the most expensive marble from a catalogue and considered the job done. He now saw the memory in a new, horrifying light. He hadn't been listening. He had never truly listened. He needed to get away from the hubbub to think. He muttered an excuse to Tiffany and made his way to the relative quiet of the terrace, the same terrace where Amelia had made her grand entrance. The cool night air did little to calm the fire in his gut. He leaned against the balustrade. The lights of the city spread before him like a taunt. This was his city, his kingdom. And an intruder had just stormed the castle. A voice next to him made him jump. Quite a view, both outside and in. It was Jonathan Webb, a contemporary of Lucian's. Webb was old money, his family's wealth, a quiet, sprawling dynasty that looked down on the noisy, striving ambition of new money men like Lucian. They were friendly rivals, but Lucian always felt the sting of Webb's condescension. Webb Lucian acknowledged gruffly. Drake Webb replied, taking a drag from a thin cigarillo. Didn't take you for a man who enjoyed dramatic theatre. But I must say, tonight's performance is a masterpiece. He exhaled a stream of smoke. Your ex is a remarkable woman. I'm aware of what she is. Lucian snapped. Webb chuckled a low, rumbling sound. No, I don't think you are. You see, you thought you divorced a housewife. We're all quickly realizing you divorced a hidden asset. Lucian turned to face him, his fists clenched. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Webb looked at him with an expression of mild pity. My dear fellow, where have you been? For the past 18 months, Amelia Sterling is the most talked-about woman in European finance. She's Sinclair's secret weapon, his consigliere, his oracle, whatever you want to call it. He doesn't make a move over 100 million without her input. The words hit Lucian like physical blows. That's impossible. She has no experience. She was an art history major. And what do you think art history is? Webb countered, his voice sharp with intellect. It's the study of provenance, of value, of authenticity, of spotting fakes. It's understanding how an object's story and its history create its worth. It's the ultimate education in valuing assets. Sinclair didn't hire an MBA, he found a strategist with a completely different operating system. Webb leaned in, his voice dropping conspiratorially. The story goes that Sinclair met her at a Sotheby's auction. She was there to sell off some of her jewelry after the divorce. A piece came up forbidding a minor Degas sketch. The auctioneer gave its provenance. Amelia, sitting in the back row, quietly raised her hand and pointed out a flaw in its history. A 5-year gap in the 1920s that suggested it might have been looted art. The bidding stopped dead. Sinclair, who was about to bid on it, was intrigued. He sought her out. The rest is the stuff of legend. Lucien's mind reeled. He remembered that day. She had told him she was selling some of the jewelry he'd given her. He'd scoffed, telling her she'd be lucky to get pennies on the dollar, that she didn't understand its real value. The memory now burned with shame. She started by advising his art foundation. Webb continued warming to his story. She restructured the entire portfolio, tripled its value in a year by finding undervalued masterpieces and identifying forgeries in their own collection. Sinclair realized her talent was wasted on paintings. He brought her into his main company, Sinclair Aerospace. She looked at schematics and supply chains the way she looked at brushstrokes and canvas weave. She found inefficiencies, identified potential, saw the story in the numbers. Webb took another puff of his cigarillo. The Shanghai Consortium deal, the one your little girlfriend was so excited about, Sinclair closed a much bigger deal with them 6 months ago. Amelia was the lead negotiator, flew to Shanghai herself. They say she conducted the entire final meeting in flawless Mandarin, which she learned in under a year. Mandarin. Amelia, who had struggled with high school French, was fluent in Mandarin. The world was no longer tilting. It was spinning, threatening to fling him into the abyss. "So you see, Drake," Webb said, his voice softening slightly, "while you were buying this year's model, you discarded a classic, a masterpiece. And a man with a much better eye for value picked her up from the discard pile." He gestured with his head back towards the ballroom. "And now, she's not just part of the collection, she's curating it." Webb stubbed out his cigarillo on the balustrade and gave Lucien a final pitying look. "A word of advice, I'd liquidate your holdings in Omnicorp first thing in the morning. Sinclair is planning a hostile takeover. It's going to be a bloodbath." He paused. "And Amelia Sterling is the one who drew up the battle plans." With that, Webb turned and walked back inside, leaving Lucien alone in the cold, his billion-dollar view of the city suddenly looking like the backdrop to his own colossal failure. He was Lucien Drake, the shark, and he was about to be devoured. The rest of the evening passed in a torturous, surreal blur. Lucien felt like a ghost at his own feast. The deference and admiration that had been his oxygen just an hour ago had vanished, replaced by furtive glances and hushed conversations that ceased the moment he drew near. He was a pariah, a walking, talking cautionary tale about underestimating a woman. He saw Tiffany across the room, desperately trying to engage a group of younger socialites, but her laughter was brittle, her smiles forced. She was adrift, and the life raft she had clung to him was taking on water at an alarming rate. Their shared spotlight had been extinguished, and in the darkness, she seemed to be realizing that the man she had attached herself to was not the titan he appeared to be, but a man who had just been publicly and spectacularly eclipsed. Lucian couldn't take his eyes off Amelia. She was a magnetic force effortlessly holding court. She discussed global politics with the senator, then pivoted to a conversation in fluent Italian with an elderly countess. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, people leaned in, hanging on her every word. She possessed a gravitas that he had never known, a weight and substance that made his own achievements feel flimsy and theatrical. He remembered her years ago, trying to talk to him about a book she was reading on geopolitical strategy. He'd waved her off, telling her to leave the big picture stuff to him. He remembered her attempts to learn about his business, asking questions he deemed too complex for her to understand. He had not been a partner. He had been a patronizing dictator, convinced of his own singular brilliance. The arrogance of it, the sheer blind stupidity, was suffocating. The final crushing blow of the evening came not from a whisper or a rumor, but from a simple public act. The charity auction began the centerpiece of the night's fundraising efforts. The items were extravagant: a week on a private island, a custom sports car, a walk-on role in a Hollywood blockbuster. The bidding was spirited, a chance for the city's wealthy to outdo one another in a public display of philanthropy and ego. The final item was announced, and now for our grand finale. The naming rights to the new pediatric care wing of the city hospital, the very cause we are all here to support tonight. The wing will be named in honor of the highest bidder. We'll start the bidding at $1 million. A hush fell over the room. This was the ultimate prize. 1 million, a voice called out. 1.5, another countered. The price climbed steadily. 2 million. 2.5. Lucian saw his chance. A small, pathetic chance to reclaim some semblance of his former glory. Winning this auction would be a statement. He could still command a room. He waited for the bidding to slow, then, in a clear, loud voice, he declared $5 million. A gasp went through the crowd. It was an audacious, almost reckless bid designed to shut down all competition. For a moment, it worked. The room was silent. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the crowd. I have $5 million from Mr. Lucian Drake. 5 million. Do I hear 6? Silence. Going once. Lucian felt a sliver of his old confidence return. He stood a little taller. Going twice. He glanced at Amelia. She was watching, her expression unreadable. 10 million. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a diamond blade. It was Dominic Sinclair. He hadn't even raised his hand, just spoken the words from his seat, his gaze fixed on the stage. The room erupted in applause and stunned murmurs. Lucian felt the blood drain from his face. He had been swatted away like a fly. He could not and would not bid higher. It would be financial suicide. He had been publicly neutered. The auctioneer, giddy, banged his gavel. Sold for $10 million to Mr. Dominic Sinclair. As the applause swelled, Sinclair stood up. He raised a hand for quiet. Thank you, he said, his voice calm and authoritative. I'm honored to support such a worthy cause. He then turned and looked directly at Amelia, a soft smile playing on his lips. However, the wing will not be named after me. It will be named the Sterling Wing, in honor of the woman whose integrity, brilliance, and compassion are the true gold standard. The room exploded. It was a checkmate, a public coronation. Sinclair had not just outbid Lucian. He had used his immense wealth to publicly knight Amelia to cement her new identity in the city's consciousness. The Sterling Wing. It was perfect, a name that signified both her and a standard of excellence. Amelia's composure finally broke, just for a second. Her eyes glistened, and she gave Sinclair a look of such profound, genuine affection and gratitude that it felt more intimate than any kiss. She then rose, took the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. "Thank you, Dominic," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but steady. "And thank you all. When I went through a difficult period in my life, 2 years ago, I felt invisible. I thought my story was over. But I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're truly made of." Her eyes found Lucian in the crowd, and for the first time, he saw not indifference, but a flicker of something that looked like pity. "I learned that your value isn't determined by who you are with, but by who you are. Thank you for this honor. I promise to be worthy of it." She received a standing ovation. Lucian remained seated, frozen in his chair, the sound of the applause like thunder in his ears. He watched as his past, his quiet, unassuming Amelia, was celebrated as a titan, a philanthropist, a symbol of resilience. He had come tonight to flaunt his new life, to celebrate his freedom from the old. Instead, he had been forced to witness the spectacular birth of the woman he had tried to erase. The party was over for him. He stood up, his body feeling heavy and old, and walked towards the exit, not even bothering to look for Tiffany. He needed to get out. He needed to breathe. As he pushed through the grand doors into the hotel lobby, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his CFO. "Lucian, urgent. Call me. There's a rumor about Omnicorp. The market in Asia is already reacting. We're going to get wiped out at the opening bell." Webb's warning on the terrace echoed in his ears. It wasn't a rumor. It was a meticulously planned execution, and Amelia Sterling was the one who had drawn up the battle plans. He stumbled out into the cool New York night, the sounds of the city a jarring cacophony. He looked up at the sky, half expecting to see the G700 circling above him like a vulture. His kingdom was crumbling. His castle was built on sand. And the tide, a formidable sapphire blue tide named Amelia Sterling, was coming in. The days that followed the charity ball were a slow-motion demolition of Lucian Drake's world. Just as Jonathan Webb had predicted, Omnicorp became a bloodbath. Sinclair's hostile takeover was not just a corporate maneuver, it was a blitzkrieg. It was elegant, brutal, and flawlessly executed. News reports lauded the genius strategy, the uncanny foresight in identifying Omnicorp's hidden weaknesses. Lucian, a significant shareholder, had been blind to. Every article that praised Sinclair's bold move implicitly condemned his own lack of vision. His phone, once a constant stream of opportunities and invitations, grew quiet. The calls he did get were from panicked investors and concerned board members at his own firm. The aura of invincibility he had so carefully crafted had been shattered in a single night. In the cutthroat world of New York finance, the scent of failure was like blood in the water, and the sharks were beginning to circle. Tiffany, predictably, disappeared. She left a short, stilted note on the marble countertop of his sterile penthouse apartment. It spoke of needing to find herself and of them wanting different things. Lucian knew what it really meant. She was abandoning a sinking ship. Her departure barely registered. She was a symptom of his hubris, and with the disease now consuming him, the symptoms were irrelevant. He found himself obsessively, pathologically searching for information about Amelia. He became a digital ghost, haunting the corners of the internet for any scrap of her new life. He discovered she had established a foundation the Sterling Initiative, which funded education for women in STEM and the arts. He found articles in Forbes and the Financial Times that referenced her not as Sinclair's partner, but as a formidable strategist in her own right. One profile, titled The Sterling Standard, detailed her unorthodox approach to investment, blending her background in art history with cutthroat market analysis. It called her the quiet force reshaping Sinclair's empire. The article included a quote from Dominic Sinclair himself. Most people see a company's balance sheet as a set of numbers. Amelia sees it as a story. She finds the plot holes. She understands the narrative of value better than anyone I've ever met. I'm just smart enough to listen to her. Lucian had to put his laptop down, a bitter acidic taste rising in his throat. She finds the plot holes. He had been the biggest plot hole in her life, a glaring inconsistency she had finally edited out. He remembered their last real conversation, the day he'd told her it was over. He had laid it all out in cold corporate terms. Their marriage was no longer a growth asset. It was a legacy, holding with diminishing returns. He was diversifying his portfolio. He had actually used those words. He had expected a scene, a negotiation. He had been prepared for it with spreadsheets of their assets and a speech about amicable separation. Instead, she had sat on the edge of their bed in the sun-filled master bedroom of the house she had so lovingly decorated, and she had simply listened. When he was finished, she hadn't cried. She had looked at him with that unnerving calm. "So, this is your valuation of me?" she had asked, her voice quiet. "A legacy holding Amelia. Be realistic," he'd said, impatient. "This is the best path forward for our future." "No, Lucian," she had corrected him, standing up. "It's the path forward for your future. You've made it very clear that I'm not in the picture." She walked over to her closet and opened it, looking at the rows of clothes he had often criticized as being too plain, too unremarkable. "The thing you don't understand about value, Lucian, is that it's not always about the price tag. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones whose worth is not immediately obvious, the ones you have to look at closely, understand their history, their substance." She turned back to him. "You've never been very good at that. You only see the sticker price." He had dismissed it as the sour grapes of a woman being discarded. Now her words haunted him. She hadn't been pleading for him to see her value. She had been delivering a final, devastating diagnosis of his own character. His desperation drove him to do something he never thought he would. He called their son. Ethan was 17, a smart, perceptive boy who had, Lucian now realized, borne the brunt of his parents' dissolving marriage with a quiet stoicism. Dad Ethan's voice was wary. They hadn't spoken in weeks. "Ethan, son, how are you? How's Switzerland?" Lucian's attempt at casual warmth sounded false even to his own ears. "It's fine. School is school. Is everything okay? You sound—" "I'm fine." Lucian cut in too quickly. "Listen, son, I saw your mother the other night." There was a pause on the line. "Yeah," Ethan said, his tone shifting, becoming guarded. "She told me she might be in New York. She seems to be doing very well," Lucian stammered, hating the weakness in his voice. "She is," Ethan said, a note of pride entering his voice. "She's amazing. I don't understand, Ethan. When did all this happen? The work with Sinclair, the travel, everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Lucian could hear the crackle of the international connection, or perhaps it was just the sound of his own world breaking apart. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice heavy, with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "It started right after you left, Dad," he said, his voice level, devoid of accusation, but heavy with fact. The first thing she did wasn't cry. The first thing she did was enroll in an online quantum computing course from MIT. Then, a macroeconomics course from LSE. She said for 15 years she had dedicated her mind to our family, and now she was going to dedicate it to herself. Lucian was speechless. Quantum computing. She would study 12-15 hours a day. Ethan continued. When I'd come home for holidays, the house was filled with books. Not art books. Books on market theory, international law, Mandarin character charts. She said you had shown her that her security couldn't depend on anyone else, so she was going to build her own. She sold the house because she said it was a non-liquid asset tied to a past narrative. She invested the money herself. She's the one who bought into Omnicorp a year ago because she saw the vulnerability you missed. She shorted it before the takeover was even announced. The revelation was a physical blow. Amelia hadn't just been the strategist for Sinclair, she had been playing the market for herself. She had used his own field of battle to fund her reinvention. I don't get it, Lucian whispered, the fight gone from his voice. Why didn't I see any of this in her? Ethan sighed, a weary, sad sound. Did you ever look? He asked the simple question, a brutal indictment. Mum said you fell in love with a sketch of her, and you got angry when she tried to become a painting. She said she spent years making herself smaller, quieter, to fit into the frame you built for her. The day you left, you didn't just leave her. You opened the door to her cage. The line went quiet again. Lucian could picture his son in his dorm room thousands of miles away, a young man who saw his parents with a clarity that they themselves had never possessed. She's happy now, Dad, Ethan said softly. She's with Dominic and he sees her. He doesn't just look at her, he actually sees who she is. He thinks her mind is the most beautiful thing about her. The call ended soon after. Lucian sat in the suffocating silence of his penthouse, the city lights glittering outside his window like a party he was no longer invited to. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost a fortune, a partner, a mind that he had been too arrogant to recognize. He had traded a masterpiece for a cheap print, and now the whole world knew. He had been so proud of the cage he had built, never realizing that all he had managed to do was imprison himself. In the weeks that followed, Lucian's life devolved into a grim parody of his former existence. He still went to his office, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that now felt like a tomb. His partners spoke to him in hushed, careful tones, as if he were a sick man. Deals that had been on the table were mysteriously pulled. Lines of credit he had taken for granted were suddenly being reviewed. The empire he had built, which he believed was forged from his own brilliance, was proving to have been built on the far more fragile foundations of reputation and perception, both of which were now in ruins. His obsession with Amelia, meanwhile, metastasized. It was no longer about understanding. It was about a desperate, clawing need to reinsert himself into her narrative. He was the ghost, now haunting the edges of her new life, invisible and irrelevant. He tracked her movements through society pages and financial news with the fervor of a conspiracy theorist. Amelia Sterling in Zurich closing a deal on sustainable technologies. Amelia Sterling in London delivering a keynote address on the future of philanthropy. Amelia Sterling on the cover of Time magazine with Dominic Sinclair, part of their 100 most influential people, issue the headline reading, "The Power of Partnership, How Dominic Sinclair and Amelia Sterling Are Remaking the World." He bought the magazine. He stared at the cover for a full hour. They stood side by side, not embracing, but partners, equals. Sinclair's arm was not around her waist. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of respect, not possession. Her expression was serene, confident, her grey eyes looking directly at the camera at him. There was no malice in her gaze, no triumph, just an unshakable sense of self. It was infuriating. One evening, consumed by a toxic cocktail of whiskey and self-pity, he did the unthinkable. He went to her. He knew from a gossip column that Sinclair and Amelia were back in New York, staying at Sinclair's private residence, a historic townhouse on the Upper East Side that he had reportedly bought and renovated for her. He took a cab lurking in the back seat like a common criminal as it pulled up across the street from the address. It was a magnificent limestone building, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It was elegant, understated, and timeless. It was everything Amelia was. Through the sheer curtains of the ground floor library, he could see them. There was no party, no crowd. It was just the two of them. Sinclair was sitting in a leather armchair, a book in his lap. Amelia was on a sofa opposite him, sketching on a large pad, her brow furrowed in concentration. A fire crackled in the hearth. They weren't speaking, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. It was the kind of silence Lucien had long ago forgotten how to share with anyone. It was the silence of true partnership. At one point, Amelia looked up from her sketch pad and said something. Sinclair looked up from his book and smiled a genuine, unguarded smile. He reached out, and she took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. It was a simple, quiet moment, but for Lucien, watching from the cold darkness of the cab, it was a stake through the heart. That was the life he could have had. That was the woman he had thrown away. The driver, a gruff man with a kind face, finally cleared his throat. "You gonna get out, pal? Or you just gonna stare all night?" The meter's running. Shame washed over Lucien. What was he doing? Stalking his ex-wife like a jilted teenager. He gave the driver his own address and sank back into the seat, defeated. His breaking point came a week later. He received a formal letter delivered by courier. The envelope was thick, expensive, cream-colored stock, bearing the simple, elegant insignia, A.S. Amelia Sterling. His hands trembled as he opened it. It wasn't a letter from a lawyer, it was from her. The handwriting was the same elegant looping script he remembered from 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards. "Lucien, I hope this letter finds you well. Enclosed, you will find the final transfer of ownership documents for your majority shares in Drake Capital. As you may be aware, your firm has become financially vulnerable over the past several weeks. A number of your key investors, concerned about the firm's stability, have sold their stakes to a private equity group. That group is one I now control. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation. The firm you built was at its core a good one, despite your recent mismanagement. I am not dissolving it. I am restructuring it. Many of your employees are talented people whose livelihoods I wish to protect. You will be bought out at a generous market valuation from 6 months ago, before your reputational damage began to affect the stock price. This should leave you with more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life, provided you live wisely. I am doing this for 2 reasons. Firstly, for Ethan. His name is Drake, and I do not wish for that name to be synonymous with catastrophic failure. He deserves a better legacy than the one you are creating. Secondly, I am doing this for the woman I used to be. The woman who helped you draft your first business plan at our kitchen table. The woman who believed in you even when you stopped believing in anything but the bottom line. She deserves to know that the foundation she helped build was not left to crumble into dust. This is the last time you will hear from me. I wish you peace, Lucien. I hope one day you find it. Amelia. He read the letter 3 times. She had bought his company, she had bought his name, his legacy, and was now remaking it in her own image. It wasn't revenge. It was, as she had said, preservation. It was a mercy killing. She hadn't come to destroy him. She had come to save the last vestiges of the man he once was, for the sake of their son. The magnanimity of it was more devastating than any act of vengeance could ever have been. She had taken everything not with a sword, but with a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away the diseased parts to save the whole. He was left with nothing but money. The power, the prestige, the identity he had spent his life building, all gone. Stripped away by the woman he had deemed worthless. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse. The city glittered below a world that no longer belonged to him. He saw his reflection in the glass, a hollowed-out man in an expensive suit. He finally understood the expression in her eyes at the ball. It wasn't pity, it was foresight. She had seen this end for him all along. She knew that a man who builds his house on the shifting sands of ego and arrogance will eventually be consumed by the tide. He had called their marriage a legacy holding with diminishing returns, and he had been right. Except the asset with diminishing returns had been him. So what becomes of a man who loses everything he thought defined him? Lucien Drake didn't end up on the streets. His ending was quieter, more psychologically brutal. He was adrift in a sea of comfortable obscurity, a ghost of Wall Street, forever haunted by the shadow of the empire he lost, and the woman who built a bigger one on its ashes. He learned the hardest lesson of all, that true power isn't about the noise you make, but about the substance you possess. Amelia Sterling, on the other hand, never looked back. She and Dominic Sinclair became a new kind of power couple, defined not by glamour, but by impact, funding innovations, reshaping industries, and proving that the greatest comeback stories are written not with revenge, but with reinvention. What did you think of Amelia's ultimate power move? Was it an act of mercy, or the most calculated revenge imaginable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories where the underestimated rise up and claim their power, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of karma triumph and sweet, sweet success.
Mistress made the millionaire. Kick out his pregnant wife. She took revenge in court. In a quiet corner of Aspen's elite society, whispers grew into rumors of a scandal unlike any other. James Harrington, a self-made millionaire known for his sharp instincts and dazzling charm, seemed to have it all: the luxurious mansion, the booming business empire, and a graceful wife named Elizabeth who was carrying his heir. But when a mysterious woman named Veronica entered James's life, she set in motion a web of seduction and deceit that would shatter an innocent family. This is the gripping tale of a wife betrayed a mistress, brazen enough to demand her eviction, and a courtroom showdown that would change everything. James Harrington's story began with a tiny glimmer of hope. Born to a middle-class family in the suburbs of Denver, he watched his parents struggle to build something from nothing. His father, Robert Harrington, spent years as a real estate broker, often coming home with dusty shoes and lines of worry etched on his forehead. His mother, Carolyn, worked part-time at a local daycare, then returned each evening to cook dinner and help with James's homework. Money was never abundant, but their home was filled with warmth and love qualities that shaped James's ambitions and moral compass. From a young age, James strove to prove he was destined for greatness. While his classmates partied, James pored over business magazines. He devoured success stories and biographies of tycoons, determined that one day he too would build an empire. He even kept a journal where he noted daily goals. He refused to let the limitations of his upbringing define his future. After high school, James took a leap and enrolled at Harvard Business School scholarships, and part-time jobs got him through those rigorous years. By the time he graduated, he had connections in Manhattan's upper circles, along with a tireless work ethic. Moving to New York City seemed like a natural step. He was in the epicenter of commerce, surrounded by the skyscrapers he'd always dreamed about. He worked in private equity for a few years, then leveraged his network to start his own venture capital fund. Over time, savvy investments in technology and real estate turned his modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar fortune. It was during a charity gala in Manhattan that James met Elizabeth Spencer, a striking brunette from a well-respected Boston family. She had graduated from Princeton in art history and worked as a curator at a small but prestigious gallery. They were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, Philip Baker, an investor from Redwood City, California, who had been a college friend of James's. According to Philip, Elizabeth was too sophisticated for a typical businessman, but it only took one conversation for James to be captivated by her intellect, grace and soft-spoken wit. Elizabeth, for her part, found James's confidence and determination refreshing. He was a whirlwind of energy, yet with an underlying kindness that reminded her of how her own father used to protect and guide her. Within 6 months, James proposed a year later in a ceremony at a sprawling Vermont estate. They exchanged vows under a canopy of fragrant pine trees. It was a fairy tale wedding. The couple enjoyed the early years of their marriage, traveling often. Monaco, Santorini, and the Maldives were just a few of their getaways. Yet they both knew that settling down and building a family was on the horizon. James's business soared, and Elizabeth transitioned from working full-time at the gallery to focusing on philanthropic endeavors. She became a key figure in Aspen's charity circuit after they decided to build a second home there. James found the mountain air rejuvenating. Elizabeth loved the community feeling. Their Aspen house, perched with a view of snow-capped peaks, became a retreat for long weekends and special gatherings with friends. Life was, by all outward appearances, perfect. They had money, prestige, a wide network of influential friends, and most importantly, a deep emotional connection that no rumor or rivalry had ever shaken. That sense of invincibility set the stage for everything that went wrong. James Harrington's fortunes often attracted opportunists, but few had the audacity of Veronica St. James. She was first introduced to James at a tech conference in San Francisco, where she presented herself as an up-and-coming consultant specializing in image branding. Veronica claimed she had helped numerous startups transform into global powerhouses by refining their public perception. She was a stunning woman, tall with fiery red hair cascading over her shoulders, and a self-assured presence that turned heads in any room she entered. Initially, James regarded her as just another ambitious professional. He listened politely to her pitch about improving his brand's outreach. She insisted that Harrington Capital James's venture fund needed a feminine perspective to truly capture new consumer markets. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had done her research. There was something about her that intrigued James, perhaps a mix of arrogance and genuine talent. She hinted at high-profile clients she had worked with, though she never provided names. A call to an acquaintance in Silicon Valley confirmed that Veronica was indeed a rising star, albeit with a reputation for blending personal relationships and professional ones. At the time, Elizabeth was in Aspen, hosting a charity event aimed at raising funds for art programs in public schools. James, left to navigate the conference alone, was flattered by Veronica's attention. She insisted they meet again later that week to discuss a potential partnership. James was unsure. After all, Harrington Capital's brand was strong. Still, curiosity got the better of him. She seemed convinced that her strategies would take his business to the next level. Their second meeting took place at a chic rooftop lounge offering panoramic views of the San Francisco skyline. Veronica arrived wearing an emerald dress that matched her eyes, making James do a double-take. Over cocktails she poured on the charm, peppering him with questions about his personal life, his passions, even his past, romantic history, all under the guise of understanding the man behind the brand. James, usually cautious, was disarmed by her intense attention. It felt good to be admired and taken so seriously by someone who exuded confidence and allure. He told himself it was all professional. She was just an eccentric consultant, and they were exploring the possibility of collaboration, but a small voice in his head warned him he might be treading dangerous ground. He thought about Elizabeth, about their upcoming plans to start trying for a child. Still, the excitement of forging new business paths overshadowed his caution. That evening ended with a handshake and a promise to continue talks. Veronica's lips curved into a coy smile as she walked away, leaving behind a faint hint of expensive perfume that lingered in the air long after she was gone. By the time James returned to Aspen and reunited with Elizabeth, he had all but forgotten about the impression Veronica had made on him. He was happy to be home with his wife. They spent a weekend skiing, laughing and planning for the future. Elizabeth had a glow about her. She was hopeful that this would be the month they'd conceive. Their conversations held a new sweetness, filled with references to possible baby names, and which guest bedroom would turn into a nursery. A few days later, while James was finalizing a deal, his phone lit up with a message. "Thinking about you. Let's schedule a call." It was from Veronica. He felt a slight pang of guilt, but he reminded himself he was free to do business with anyone he chose. Yet the tone of her message felt personal, not purely professional. He replied with a short formal email, suggesting a call the following week. Her response was almost immediate. "I'm available any time for you." Curiosity pulled James in. He rationalized that she was eager to land him as a client, nothing more. But their scheduled 20-minute call stretched into an hour. She made him laugh with witty stories about her other clients, though she never named them. She asked about his upcoming projects and made him elaborate on what kept him up at night in business. She concluded with a playful line, "If your wife ever needs tips for brand building too, I'm here," ending with a throaty laugh. After the call, James sat quietly gazing at his phone. Something about Veronica was magnetic. That evening, Elizabeth picked up on his distracted mood. She asked him if everything was all right at work. James waved it off, attributing it to the stress of a big upcoming meeting. Elizabeth believed him. He had never given her reason to doubt him. Over the next few weeks, Veronica continued to text James. Their messages gradually became less about marketing campaigns and more about personal details. How was your dinner with the investors tonight? You must be exhausted. Let me know if you need anything. The subtlety of her approach was key. Her words were always ambiguous enough to pass as caring for a client, but laced with an undertone that hinted at something deeper. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found out she was pregnant. The news transformed the house into a haven of joy. She surprised James with the positive pregnancy test hidden inside a little gift box. He was over the moon, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Elizabeth teased him that he'd better build a bigger closet for all the baby's things. He insisted he'd start on the nursery that very week. For a brief period, it seemed the pregnancy overshadowed any budding flirtation with Veronica. James minimized his calls and messages to her life, refocused on Elizabeth's checkups, planning for a future with a child, and expanding his business to secure a legacy. However, Veronica was persistent. During a trip to Los Angeles for a meeting, James found himself alone in a hotel bar, bored and slightly stressed. A single text to Veronica. In LA for a few days, opened a door he should have kept locked. It started with a casual dinner. Veronica claimed she was already in Los Angeles on business. She suggested they meet at a high-end Japanese restaurant, known for its exclusive clientele. James, who prided himself on maintaining a professional boundary, told himself it was just a meal between colleagues. But the subtle flirting escalated. Veronica dressed in a sleek black dress. Her hair glossy under the restaurant's dim lights, kept leaning closer. Laughing at his jokes and brushing her hand against his, James felt a swirl of guilt and excitement. He tried to keep the conversation about business, but Veronica had a talent for pivoting to personal topics. She asked about his hopes for fatherhood, making comments like, "I'm sure you'll be an amazing dad," followed by a lingering gaze that seemed to challenge him to cross an invisible line. By dessert, his phone pinged with a text from Elizabeth asking how his meeting went. He felt a wave of shame and ended the evening swiftly. Veronica, however, was prepared. She offered him a ride back to his hotel in her rented luxury car. The moment James shut the passenger door, she leaned over and kissed him. It was brief but electric. He froze, pulled away and mumbled a weak protest. She apologized demurely, but her eyes flashed with triumph. Even in his confused state, James recognized a pivotal moment. He could walk away, or he could indulge the temptation. He rationalized, "It's just one kiss." In the weeks that followed, that single moment of weakness spiraled into a full-blown affair. They met in secret every time James traveled to San Francisco or Los Angeles. Veronica was always waiting, always dressed to kill. She showered James with compliments and made him feel like the most powerful man in the world. He still loved Elizabeth, but something about Veronica's brazen desire thrilled him. He told himself it was just physical, a wild detour before returning to the comfortable life he knew. Elizabeth's pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and when he was home in Aspen or New York, James devoted himself to her, but the guilt grew like a venomous weed in his chest. Veronica had no interest in playing second fiddle indefinitely. She was cunning and manipulative, skilled at reading James's vulnerabilities. As he grew more distant, she grew more demanding. She told him she wanted to be more than a secret. She hinted that Elizabeth might not be the only one who could give him a child. She teased him about how they'd be a power couple if they were together publicly. Slowly, she planted the seeds of an idea that Elizabeth was holding him back from his greatest potential. James tried to fight these suggestions, but he was in over his head. The more he tried to distance himself, the more Veronica found ways to pull him back in. She threatened to appear at his public events, or worse, call Elizabeth. Feeling trapped, James tried to placate her by promising more time and attention. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, now in her second trimester, noticed he was more anxious than ever, but couldn't pinpoint why. When Elizabeth was 5 months pregnant, she planned a lavish baby shower in Aspen, inviting close friends and family. The house was filled with pastel decorations, gourmet food, and excited chatter about the baby's imminent arrival. James's mother, Caroline, flew in from Denver, thrilled about becoming a grandmother. Elizabeth's sister, Sarah Spencer, came from Boston. The mood was joyous, but James kept checking his phone. He couldn't relax, fearing Veronica might do something rash. As Elizabeth and her guests played baby-related games, James excused himself to take a call. Sure enough, it was Veronica. She was furious that he was playing the role of devoted husband and expectant father in front of society while leaving her in the shadows. She threatened to crash the event. James begged her to stay away, promising to see her soon. Her response was a hiss of anger. "Either you tell Elizabeth about us, or I will." James ended the call feeling cornered. That evening, after the guests left, he stood by the nursery window, watching Elizabeth carefully stack the gifts. She was radiant, sporting a maternity dress that showed off her growing belly. A surge of guilt overtook him. He felt like the worst husband in the world. He tried to imagine a clean break from Veronica, but she had grown too vindictive. He could already see the tabloids and social media storms that would erupt if she exposed the affair. Veronica wasn't bluffing. The next morning, while Elizabeth was at a prenatal appointment, James received an envelope delivered by a private courier to their Aspen home. Inside were photos of him and Veronica in intimate moments, leaving a hotel, kissing in a secluded corner, even one from a penthouse suite where they had shared a secret weekend. Attached was a typed note. "Decide where your loyalty lies. I won't be a side piece any longer." James called Veronica, immediately, voice quaking with rage and terror. She answered calmly, as if she were expecting his call. "James," she said smoothly, "I want you to kick Elizabeth out. Divorce her. Don't worry about the baby. We can have our own. I'm not going to be quiet anymore." He sputtered objections, reminding her Elizabeth was pregnant, and that he did love his wife. Veronica was unmoved. "Do as I say, or I'll show these photos to every newspaper and business outlet in the country. Let's see how your precious public image holds up then. And let's not forget, if Elizabeth sees them first, she'll clean you out in court." As Veronica's words sank in, James knew he was headed for the darkest chapter of his life. The snowfall outside their Aspen mansion was gentle that evening, blanketing the pine trees and rooftops in pristine white. Inside, Elizabeth Harrington, curled up on the living room couch, a pregnancy book open in her lap, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. The baby had just kicked, and she smiled to herself. These were the moments she cherished, the quiet anticipation of motherhood, the warmth of her home, the belief that everything was as it should be. But something was wrong. Over the past week, James had become distant. He no longer kissed her forehead each morning. He barely touched his dinner. When she asked how his meetings went, he answered with clipped words, avoiding eye contact. Elizabeth tried to brush it off as work stress. After all, he had massive investments in motion, and the stock market had dipped unexpectedly. But in her heart, she knew this was more than business pressure. "James," she had asked 2 nights ago, "is everything okay between us?" He'd simply nodded, distracted by his phone. "Just tired, don't worry." But she did worry. That evening, Elizabeth had prepared a simple dinner, grilled salmon and wild rice, one of James's favorites. She lit candles, hoping to coax back some of their old connection. Yet he barely touched the food. He paced the floor like a man trapped in a cage, running a hand through his hair, mumbling inaudibly, "James," she said, gently rising from her chair. "Please talk to me." He stopped mid-step, turned to her, and for the first time she saw it, the storm in his eyes. Not just frustration or worry. Something colder. Something final. "We need to talk," he said stiffly. Elizabeth's heart skipped. She eased herself down onto the couch, one hand instinctively wrapping around her belly. "All right, I'm listening." James remained standing. I think we rushed into having this baby. I'm not sure this marriage is working." His words hit her like a slap. At first she couldn't speak. Her throat went dry. "What are you talking about?" she finally whispered. "We've been happy. You were thrilled when we found out I don't know if I want a baby anymore," he said. And even he flinched at the lie as it escaped his lips. Elizabeth gasped, "James, please don't say that. We've talked about starting a family for years. You were the one who painted the nursery. You picked the crib." James couldn't look at her. Every word she said was a dagger of guilt. He had played house with her while sneaking around behind her back. And now, under the crushing weight of Veronica's threats, he had convinced himself that pushing Elizabeth away might somehow prevent a larger collapse. "I need space," he said, voice colder now. "This marriage, it's suffocating me." Elizabeth stood trembling. "Is this about someone else?" she asked quietly. "Are you seeing someone?" James's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "Oh my God, you are... I didn't mean for it to happen," he said hoarsely. "It's complicated. I can't do this right now." She stared at him, stunned. "I'm carrying your child, James. Our child. How can you just walk away from that?" "I'm not walking away." He insisted, though. The words sounded hollow, even to him. "I just need time. I need you to leave for now. Stay somewhere else." Elizabeth's face drained of color. "You're kicking me out of our home, while I'm 5 months pregnant?" "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I'll pay for anything you need. Just not here." Elizabeth's voice broke. "You coward, you can't even admit what this really is. You're not asking for space. You're choosing someone else over your family." James winced. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "I didn't make this hard, James." She snapped through tears. "You did." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elizabeth's breaths came in sharp, shallow bursts as she tried to hold herself together. Her hands trembled. The room spun around her, and she gripped the back of the couch to steady herself. Then slowly she turned and walked down the hall to their bedroom. It took her nearly an hour to pack. She was methodical, mechanical folding maternity clothes and toiletries into a weekender bag. She paused over the ultrasound photo taped to her mirror, her fingertips brushing the image of the tiny baby inside her. A sob escaped her lips, and she clutched the photo to her chest. When she returned to the front door, James was still standing there, arms folded. "I'll stay at the Rosewood Inn," she said, her voice tight. "Don't worry, you won't have to see me." He nodded once, but she didn't wait for him to speak again. She pulled on her coat, lifted her bag, and stepped into the cold night. The snow was thicker now. Her tires crunched against the icy driveway as she drove away from the home they had built together. She didn't know where she was headed beyond that night, or how she would explain any of this to her family. All she knew was that she had never felt so humiliated, abandoned, and alone. Back inside the house, James sank onto the couch, head in his hands. He stared at the framed ultrasound photo on the mantel, the only remnant Elizabeth hadn't taken. The silence was deafening, and the scent of her lavender candles still lingered in the air. A cruel echo of everything he had just destroyed. The next morning, Veronica arrived with a suitcase and a smile, already talking about reorganizing the kitchen and repainting the nursery. James didn't respond. He simply turned away, because deep down he knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross, and the price of that betrayal had only just begun to unfold. Would you like to continue with Chapter 7, rewritten in the same style and length? Days turned into weeks, and Elizabeth's once bright future appeared broken beyond repair. She stayed at the small inn until her credit card bills piled up. Worried about finances and medical care, she finally confided in her sister, Sarah Spencer, who flew in from Boston immediately. Furious and alarmed, Sarah convinced Elizabeth to move into a modest rental cabin she secured for them. Sarah fronted the deposit, refusing to let her pregnant sister live in misery at a motel Elizabeth's obstetrician. Dr. Marianne Keller noticed the emotional stress was affecting her health. She emphasized that Elizabeth needed stability and supportive care for the sake of her unborn child. Embarrassed but determined, Elizabeth started consulting with local attorneys. She reached out to a family friend, Mark Dawson, an attorney based in Denver who specialized in divorce and estate law. When Elizabeth tearfully explained what happened, Mark's outrage was palpable. All the more reason to build a strong case, he asserted. There's a lot at stake here. Your financial security, the baby's future. If James is under someone else's control, we need to uncover the truth. Don't let shame keep you from pursuing justice. Elizabeth agreed. Over multiple phone calls and meetings, Mark and Sarah helped piece together the timeline of events. Elizabeth had no hard evidence of James's affair, only a gut feeling and the shock of his abrupt change in behavior. But Mark was certain that if they dug deep enough, they might find proof. Maybe she could subpoena his phone records or bank statements. Mark also considered hiring a private investigator to track Veronica's background. Elizabeth hesitated. She still loved James and prayed he would come to his senses. But she also knew she needed to protect herself and her baby. And then a small miracle occurred. She received a call from Carolyn Harrington, James's mother. Caroline, who had heard rumors but hadn't gotten the full story, was aghast. She'd tried calling James, but he brushed her off, making vague excuses that he and Elizabeth were taking a break. Sensing foul play, Caroline reached out to Elizabeth. When she learned the shocking truth that James had kicked his pregnant wife out of their home, Caroline was livid. "It's not like my son at all," she told Elizabeth. "I know James. Something must be terribly wrong for him to act this way." Caroline flew to Aspen to see Elizabeth, bringing emotional and financial support. She felt partially responsible, believing she'd failed in raising James with enough moral backbone to resist temptation. After hearing about Mark Dawson's plan, Caroline offered to contact some of James's associates to see if they had any leads on who this Veronica woman was. She was resolved. If her son was embroiled in a scandal, she wanted to help Elizabeth, her daughter-in-law and mother, to her grandchild get justice, or at least some security. While Elizabeth and her small support team worked quietly in Aspen, James's life in the mansion with Veronica was spiraling. Veronica spent lavishly, using James's credit cards without restraint. She redecorated rooms to suit her taste, removing any trace of Elizabeth. She even made casual remarks like, "We should turn the nursery into an office. I need space to work on my branding projects." James was horrified. He clung to the baby furniture and decorations, telling her they should wait before making drastic changes. Veronica rolled her eyes. She'd gotten what she wanted, or so she thought, behind the scenes. Mark Dawson hired a skilled private investigator, Andrea Phillips, to dig into Veronica's past. Andrea discovered that Veronica had been married once before to a wealthy businessman from Miami who had mysteriously lost a chunk of his fortune shortly after their divorce. Rumors suggested Veronica had walked away with a sizable settlement thanks to well-timed leverage. The patterns were too similar to ignore. Next, Andrea looked for any digital footprints connecting James and Veronica. She struck gold, suspicious hotel reservations, dinner receipts, and even a series of cryptic messages that implied blackmail. Veronica had once texted James a line about photos that could ruin everything. Though it wasn't an outright admission, it was enough to raise eyebrows in a courtroom. Elizabeth was torn when she saw the evidence. On the one hand, it confirmed her worst fears that James had indeed been having an affair for months. On the other hand, it gave her a sense of vindication. She was not crazy or unlovable. She was the victim of a well-orchestrated scheme. Caroline Harrington, meanwhile, got in touch with a couple of James's long-time business partners, including Philip Baker from Redwood City. The mutual friend who'd introduced James and Elizabeth Phillip mentioned that James had seemed on edge for months and had confided vaguely about a woman threatening him. From that conversation, Caroline and Elizabeth deduced that James might actually regret his actions, but felt blackmailed into compliance. Elizabeth wrestled with her feelings. She knew James had betrayed her, but if he was under Veronica's thumb, did he deserve a second chance, or at least some understanding? Sarah scoffed at the idea of forgiveness, while Mark reminded Elizabeth to focus on the legal battle. Elizabeth's unborn child was her priority. Eventually, Mark decided to file for divorce on Elizabeth's behalf, citing emotional and financial abandonment, along with adultery. He also prepared a separate lawsuit for spousal support and child support. Before serving the papers, Mark gave James one final chance to reconcile amicably. He had Caroline deliver a letter personally to James, detailing Elizabeth's demands: full spousal support, property division, and an agreement to co-parent once the baby was born. James felt like a man drowning in quicksand. On one side, Veronica threatened to destroy his reputation if he kicked her out. On the other, his mother and Elizabeth's lawyer demanded an equitable divorce settlement that could tarnish his finances and brand even more if he refused. Meanwhile, the guilt of abandoning his pregnant wife gnawed at him. Daily, Veronica escalated her manipulation. She discovered Caroline's letter on James's desk, read it, and flew into a rage. "You're still talking to her, trying to negotiate behind my back," she screamed. "You're pathetic. I told you to get rid of her." She ripped the letter to shreds in front of him. James shouted back, reminding her that he had a child on the way, that he was already giving her everything she asked for. But Veronica sneered. "Maybe I should just call the tabloids. Now let them know what's really going on. Then you'll see who's in control." That evening, James locked himself in his study, ignoring Veronica's dramatic pleas from the hallway. He couldn't sleep. He drank whiskey, stared at the nursery, and contemplated how his life had unraveled. For the first time, James began to suspect he might lose everything if he didn't act swiftly. Yes, Elizabeth might divorce him, but perhaps he could salvage a relationship with his unborn child if he came clean. In a moment of clarity, James called Philip Baker. Voice shaking, he confessed the affair, the blackmail, and his terror at losing his empire. Philip, though disappointed, was more worried for James's mental health and Elizabeth's well-being. "Come clean, James." Philip insisted, "Stop letting that woman ruin your life. If you show genuine remorse, we can manage the public backlash. It's the only way. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the examination table, one hand on her belly, the other gripping her phone. Her obstetrician, Dr. Keller, had just stepped out to fetch some routine lab results, but Elizabeth couldn't focus. Her phone buzzed for the 4th time in less than 5 minutes. She hesitated before picking it up again, already dreading what she would see. Another message from an unknown number. Maybe next time, pick a man who doesn't cheat. Another gold digger. The whole world knows now. And then he left you for someone better. Get over it. Elizabeth stared at the words, numbs. Her ears rang. Her breath quickened, and her stomach churned not from pregnancy, but from a rising tide of humiliation and rage. She opened her email and found several gossip site links forwarded anonymously. One headline read, "Millionaire breaks free from clingy pregnant wife, finds true love." They'd published photos of her from charity events, twisted her background into a narrative of calculated social climbing, and painted James as a victim of manipulation. Her pregnancy was described as a trap. And worst of all, she knew exactly who had orchestrated this smear campaign. Veronica Elizabeth dropped the phone onto the exam table and buried her face in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. But the dam broke. She sobbed uncontrollably, sharp, painful cries that echoed through the sterile room. By the time Dr. Keller returned, Elizabeth was curled on her side, shaking, "Oh, sweetheart." Dr. Keller rushed to her. "You're under too much stress. This isn't good for you or the baby." "I know," Elizabeth whispered between sobs. I didn't ask for any of this." When she left the clinic later that afternoon, Sarah was waiting in the parking lot. One look at Elizabeth's face, and Sarah opened her arms without a word. Elizabeth collapsed into her sister's embrace. "They're saying horrible things about me," Elizabeth gasped. "The media online. I don't even know how they got this story." Sarah's jaw clenched. "That vulture must have leaked it." "Veronica. She's desperate and clearly unhinged. She's ruining my life," Elizabeth whispered. "Then it's time we ruin hers." That night at their rental cabin, Elizabeth laid the gossip articles out across the kitchen table. Sarah hovered behind her, reading with disgust. "I'm going to sue her," Elizabeth said firmly, fire flickering in her eyes. "I don't care how long it takes. She can't get away with this." "Damn right she won't." The next morning they met with Mark Dawson. He listened in silence as Elizabeth laid out what had happened. Every message, every article, every cruel whisper that had followed her since that day at the clinic. When she was finished, Mark tapped a folder on his desk. "I suspected something like this might happen. I've already started drafting the defamation lawsuit. What Veronica's done is not only malicious, it's traceable. These leaks didn't come out of nowhere. Her fingerprints are all over them." "But how do we prove it?" Elizabeth asked. "She's smart, manipulative. She's also sloppy," Mark replied. "People like Veronica think they're untouchable. That arrogance leaves a trail." He leaned forward. "We'll subpoena the tabloid publishers. If even one of them admits she was their source, we have grounds for real damages. In the meantime, I'm filing for a gag order to stop her from spreading more lies." Elizabeth nodded, slowly, absorbing every word. "And James, do you think he was part of this?" Mark paused. "I doubt it. If anything, I think she's acting without his consent now. Our PI Andrea has found signs that James is trying to pull away from her. He's cornered. My guess is he's just too weak to fight her off." Elizabeth looked away, heart aching despite herself. The next day, Andrea called with an update. "I found something," she said over the speakerphone. Veronica's used this tactic before I tracked down 2 of her former partners. Both wealthy, both ended their relationships in shambles after she leaked false information to tabloids. She uses humiliation like a weapon Andrea sent over, screenshots, social media posts, anonymous blog entries, all eerily similar to Elizabeth's current nightmare. It was enough to establish a pattern of behavior. A judge would see it. And more importantly, the world would see the truth. That night, Elizabeth sat alone in the small nursery they'd been preparing in the cabin. A soft yellow mobile hung above the crib, spinning lazily. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bassinet, her thoughts swirling. She thought of the nights she and James had stayed up, talking about baby names. The way he used to rest his hand on her belly, waiting for kicks. The way he promised he'd always protect her. And then she thought of how easily he'd let Veronica in. How fast he had let go. But tonight, for the first time, Elizabeth wasn't drowning in grief. She was done waiting for apologies or rescue. She had something better. Evidence, allies, and a righteous fire that burned hotter with every cruel headline. 3 days later, James finally returned her call. His voice was low, hesitant. "Elizabeth, I didn't know she'd do this. I swear to you, I never meant for your name to be dragged like this." She said nothing. She went behind my back. I didn't approve of any media leak. Elizabeth finally spoke. "But you didn't stop her either. You let her move into my house. You let her take everything. I was scared." He admitted. "She threatened to destroy me. You destroyed me." "James," she replied coldly. "And you let her do it." A long silence followed. Then Elizabeth added, "You can try to fix this in court. That's all I have left to say." And she hung up. The next morning, Mark filed the defamation lawsuit and secured an emergency motion for a protective order. The legal wheels began to turn. Elizabeth wasn't just reacting anymore, she was in control. Sarah bought celebratory muffins, but Elizabeth didn't smile. "Not yet. I'll smile when Aurora is born." "Safe," she said. "And when I walk into court with my head held high, and this time the world would hear her side of the story." The day of the preliminary divorce hearing arrived. The Colorado courthouse was packed with curious onlookers, journalists, and even a few members of Aspen's high society. Elizabeth wore a modest dress, her pregnant belly clearly visible. James arrived alone, looking drained, while Veronica stood on the sidelines, wearing oversized sunglasses, hoping to remain invisible to the official proceedings. Mark Dawson presented the case for Elizabeth. The documented evidence of James's affair, the abrupt eviction of his pregnant wife, and Veronica's probable blackmail. He also introduced evidence of Veronica's pattern of manipulation from Andrea's investigation. It painted a vivid picture of Elizabeth as the wronged party carrying James's child, who deserved substantial financial protection and custody arrangements. When James took the stand, he faltered at first, struggling to find the right words. He admitted to the affair, explained how it began, and then tearfully expressed remorse for betraying Elizabeth. He painted himself as a fool who fell under Veronica's spell and threats. He admitted under oath that Veronica had demanded he evict Elizabeth, and that he had followed through out of fear and stupidity. It was a stunning confession. Veronica, furious at James's admission, stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clacking angrily on the polished floor. In the hallway, she launched a tirade at a waiting reporter, spouting claims that James was lying, that Elizabeth was a master manipulator, and that she, Veronica, had been misled and seduced by James's wealth. The reporter took notes, eyes gleaming at the dramatic turn of events. The judge, Honorable Rebecca Sinclair, was unimpressed by any attempts to shift blame. She ordered a thorough financial review to ensure Elizabeth received a fair portion of James's assets and monthly support for the unborn child. She also granted a temporary restraining order against Veronica, preventing her from contacting Elizabeth. During a recess, James approached Elizabeth quietly. He said he was sorry for everything. Elizabeth, tears in her eyes, nodded, but said little. She carried too much hurt to forgive quickly, yet seeing him finally stand up to Veronica gave her a sliver of respect for him, if not for their marriage, then for the sake of their unborn child. Veronica's meltdown was just getting started. She took to social media, posting cryptic messages about lives she had ruined. She sold her version of the story to a tabloid, claiming that James had promised her marriage and a lavish lifestyle. In doing so, she inadvertently exposed her own manipulative tendencies. Messages she shared to paint James as the aggressor also revealed how she pressured him to leave Elizabeth. The media, sensing a bigger scoop, dug into Veronica's past. One investigative journalist discovered that her former husband in Miami had quietly sued her for fraud, but the case settled out of court. Another tabloid found acquaintances willing to speak about her consistent pattern of targeting wealthy men, amassing hush payments, and leaving once their finances took a hit. The tide of public sentiment turned against Veronica, labeling her a serial gold digger and black widow. Under this pressure, Veronica vanished from Aspen, leaving James with unpaid credit card bills and a tarnished reputation. As the lawsuits piled up, Elizabeth's divorce and defamation claims, potential charges from other former targets, Veronica decided to flee the country. Rumors placed her in Europe, living under a different name, but nobody seemed to care enough to track her down. The damage she had inflicted was already done, and her illusions of grandeur evaporated in the harsh spotlight of public exposure. The final divorce settlement came 6 weeks later. Under Colorado law and guided by the judge's order, Elizabeth was awarded a substantial monthly allowance for herself and the baby, which would continue until the child turned 18. She also received a significant lump sum, reflecting the years she had supported James as he built his empire. The judge acknowledged that Elizabeth had sacrificed her own career prospects and deserved financial stability. James was granted the right to see his child, provided he adhered to certain conditions that the court deemed necessary for the child's welfare. Elizabeth, with guidance from Mark and Sarah, decided to move into a comfortable home near the hospital, where she planned to give birth. She wanted to focus on creating a peaceful environment for the baby's arrival. Caroline Harrington remained supportive, promising to help Elizabeth any way she could. As for James, he realized the price he'd paid for his moment of weakness. His business image had taken a hit, though his core investments remained strong. Most painfully, he'd lost the trust of the woman he once loved deeply. He found himself spending nights alone in a once happy home that now felt like a mausoleum of regrets. Without Veronica's presence, the mansion was eerily quiet, a constant reminder of the havoc he had unleashed. Yet James tried to find a path toward redemption. He underwent therapy sessions to understand his actions, donated to organizations supporting single mothers, and even set up a scholarship, in Elizabeth's name, at a local art college, hoping to reflect the passions she once nurtured. He was determined to be a present father if Elizabeth would allow it. A few months later, Elizabeth went into labor on a crisp autumn evening. Sarah rushed her to the hospital, calling James only because Elizabeth insisted. Despite everything she felt, James deserved the chance to see his child enter the world. James arrived breathless and anxious, carrying flowers. The tension between him and Sarah was palpable, but Elizabeth was in the throes of contractions, and no one had time for past grievances. After several hours of labor, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Aurora Grace. Harrington. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. Holding her daughter for the first time, she realized that all the betrayal and heartbreak could never overshadow the joy of this precious new life. James entered the hospital room with tears streaming down his face. He gently cradled Aurora, whispering apologies and promises that he would do right by her. Elizabeth watched tears in her eyes, uncertain about the future, but grateful that Aurora had a father present at her birth. For a moment, it was as if the world paused, allowing them a brief reprieve from all the drama that had led to this moment. Over the following weeks, Elizabeth focused on motherhood. She and James established a visitation schedule that allowed him to see Aurora regularly. Though Elizabeth remained guarded, Sarah eventually returned to Boston, confident that her sister was regaining her sense of self. Caroline made frequent visits, doting on her granddaughter and supporting Elizabeth. She never stopped chastising James for his betrayal, but she also encouraged him to step up as a father. Slowly, James built a routine around Aurora, feeding her changing diapers and reading bedtime stories. Each act felt like a step toward redemption, even if he knew he might never fully earn Elizabeth's forgiveness. Financially stable now, Elizabeth decided to revive her passion for art. She opened a small gallery in Aspen, focusing on local artists. The community rallied around her, partly out of sympathy for her ordeal, but mostly because they saw her genuine love for art. Her gallery became a humble success, and she felt pride in rebuilding her life on her terms. James, meanwhile, poured himself into philanthropic endeavors. He stepped away from the more cutthroat aspects of his business, leaving them to a trusted partner. He dedicated time and resources to supporting pregnant women in crisis, a cause that resonated deeply after witnessing what Elizabeth went through. Privately, he prayed. Elizabeth might eventually see that he had changed, though he understood the scars might never fully heal. Nearly a year after Aurora's birth, Elizabeth agreed to meet James for dinner this time, not about legal matters or custody schedules. She had seen how lovingly he cared for their daughter. She also wanted them to have a civil relationship for Aurora's sake. The dinner took place at a quiet bistro in Aspen, where they shared a private corner table. James looked nervous, wearing a simple suit and carrying a bouquet of lilies, Elizabeth's favorite. She accepted them with a small smile. The conversation was tentative at first, focusing on Aurora's milestones. Then they ventured into more personal territory. The affair, the betrayal, and how each of them had changed. Elizabeth admitted she still felt anger and hurt, but she also believed in second chances. James, his voice thick with emotion, said he regretted everything. He didn't plead for a reconciliation. He simply thanked her for allowing him to be part of Aurora's life. By the end of the evening, they parted with a warm handshake. It wasn't a grand romantic reunion, but it was a sign of progress, a glimmer of hope for co-parenting harmony. The final piece of Elizabeth's legal battles concerned the defamation suit. With Veronica gone, the process dragged, but Mark Dawson pressed forward. The judge ultimately ruled in Elizabeth's favor, awarding her damages for the slander that labeled her a gold digger. Though collecting payment from Veronica was unlikely given her disappearance, the judgment publicly cleared Elizabeth's name. The media moved on, chasing fresher scandals. Elizabeth's story lingered only as a cautionary tale in certain circles. She found solace in the knowledge that her reputation was restored, that she had stood up for herself in the face of injustice, and that her daughter would grow up knowing her mother fought back. 2 years later, Elizabeth was thriving. Her gallery had expanded, and she'd opened a second location in Denver. Aurora was a spirited toddler who adored splashing in puddles and painting with her fingers. James had remained consistent in Aurora's life. Over time, he and Elizabeth forged a respectful friendship, though romance never fully rekindled. They agreed that Aurora deserved 2 parents who genuinely cared for her without the toxicity of their past, overshadowing her future. James continued therapy, working through the guilt and learning from his catastrophic mistakes. He channeled his ambition into more ethical business ventures and philanthropic work. He even served on the board of a foundation dedicated to helping vulnerable women escape manipulative relationships. For him, it was a form of atonement. Veronica's fate remained a mystery. Some believed she'd latched onto another wealthy target in Europe. Others speculated she was living off the funds she had siphoned away. But the world had grown weary of her drama. She became little more than a ghost story among Aspen's elite circles, an example of how greed and manipulation could lead to spectacular downfall. Elizabeth often reflected on her journey. She had faced unimaginable heartbreak and public humiliation, yet she emerged stronger with new purpose. She had found her own independence, raised a beautiful child, and refused to let betrayal define her. In her quiet moments, she felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the friends who stood by her, and for the chance to create a stable, happy home for Aurora. Though she would never forget the pain, Elizabeth Harrington had built a new life from the ashes of her broken marriage. In a way, her courtroom revenge wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming her dignity and forging a future where she and her daughter could flourish. And that, in the end, was her greatest triumph. And so ends the tumultuous tale of how a cunning mistress orchestrated the ousting of a pregnant wife, only for that wife to rise, fight back in the courtroom, and find her own path to victory. Elizabeth's journey reminds us that even in the darkest twists of betrayal, resilience, courage, and a fierce determination to protect what truly matters can triumph over treachery. If you were captivated by the drama twists and ultimate redemption, be sure to let us know. Did this story move you, shock you, or inspire you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another real-life drama or gripping tale of betrayal and revenge. Your support helps us continue bringing you the most riveting stories from all corners of life. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay true to yourself and stand firm against any storm that life may bring.